Section 3. On what account men are enemies to God. The general reason is that God is opposite to them in the worship of their idols. The apostasy of man summarily consists in departing from the true God to idols, forsaking his Creator and setting up other things in his room. When God at first created man, he was united to his Creator. The God that made him was his God. The true God was the object of his highest respect, and had the possession of his heart. Love to God was the principle in his heart that rules over all other principles, and everything in the soul was wholly in subjection to it. But when man fell, he departed from the true God, and the union that was between his heart and his Creator was broken. He wholly lost his principle of love to God, and henceforth man clave to other gods. He gave that respect to the creature which is due to the Creator. When God ceased to be the object of his supreme love and respect, other things, of course, became the objects of it. Man will necessarily have something that he respects as his God. If man does not give his highest respect to the God that made him, there will be something else that has the possession of it. Men will either worship the true God or some idol. It is impossible it should be otherwise. Something will have the heart of man, and that which a man gives to his heart may be called his God. And therefore, when man by the fall extinguished all love to the true God, he set up the creature in his room. For having lost his esteem and love of the true God, and set up other gods in his room, and in opposition to him, and God still demanding their worship and opposing them, enmity necessarily follows. That which a man chooses for his God, he sets his heart mainly upon. And nothing will soon excite enmity as opposition in that which is dearest. A man will be the greatest enemy to him who opposes him in what he chooses for his God. He will look on none as standing so much in his way as he that would deprive him of his God. Judges 18:24. Ye have taken away my gods, and what have I more? A man in this respect cannot serve two masters that stand in competition for his service. And not only, if he serves one, he cannot serve the other, but if he cleaves to one, he will necessarily hate the other. Matt 6:24. No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon. And this is the very reason that men hate God. In this case it is, as when two kings set up in one kingdom, in opposition one to the other, and they both challenge the same throne, and are competitors for the same crown. They who are loyal, hearty subjects to the one, will necessarily be enemies to the other. As that which is man's gold is the object of his highest love, so that God, who chiefly opposes him in it, must be the object of his greatest hatred. The gods which a natural man worships, instead of the God that made him, are himself and the world. He has withdrawn his esteem and honor from God, and proudly exalts himself. As Satan was not willing to be in subjection, and therefore rebelled, and set up himself, so a natural man, in the proud and high thoughts he has of himself, sets up himself upon God's throne. He gives his heart to the world, worldly riches, worldly pleasures, and worldly honors. They have the possession of that regard which is due to God. The apostle sums up all the idolatry of wicked men in their love of the world. 1 John 2:15-16. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the apostle James observes that a man must necessarily be the enemy of the true God, if he be a friend of the world. Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. James 4:4. All the sin that men commit is what they do in the service of their idols. There is no one act of sin, but what is an act of worship to some false god. And therefore, whereinsoever God opposes sin in them, he is opposite to their worship of their idols, on which account they are his enemies. God opposes them in their service of their idols in the following respects. First, he manifests his utter abhorrence to their attachment to their idols. Their idols are what they love above all things. They would by no means part with them. This wickedness is sweet unto them. Job 20:12. If you take them away, what have they more? If they lose their idols, they lose their all. To rend away their idols from them would be more grievous to them than to rend the body and soul asunder. It is like rending their heart in twain. They love their idolatry, but God does not approve of it, but exceedingly hates it. He will by no means be reconciled to it, and therefore they hate him. God declares an infinite hatred of every act they do in the service of their false gods. He declares himself to be a holy and a jealous God, a God who is very jealous of his own honor, and that greatly abhors giving that honor to another. Second, he utterly forbids their cleaving to those idols, and all the services that they do to them. He not only shows that he dislikes it, but he utterly forbids it, and demands that they should worship him, serve him only, and give their hearts wholly to him, without tolerating any competitor. He allows them to serve their idols in no degree, but requires them to cast them away utterly and pay no more worship to them at any time. He requires a final parting with their idols, not only that they should refrain from them for a while, but cast them away forever, and never gratify their idolatrous respect to them any more. This is so exceedingly contrary to them, and what they are so adverse to, that they are enemies to God for it. They cannot endure God's commands, because they forbid all that in which their hearts are so engaged. And as they hate God's commands, so they hate him whose commands they are. Third, he threatens them with everlasting damnation for their service of their idols. He threatens them for their past idolatry. He threatens them with his eternal wrath for their having departed from him and their having chosen to themselves other gods. He threatens them for that disposition they have in their hearts to cleave to other gods. He threatens the least degrees of that respect which they have in their hearts to their idols. He manifests that he will not tolerate any regard to them, but has fixed eternal death as the wages of every degree of it. And he will not release them from their guilt. He holds them to their obligations, and he will accept of no atonement that they can make. He will not forgive them for whatever they do in religion, whatever pains they take, whatever tears they shed. He will accept of no money or price that they have to offer. And he threatens every future act of their idolatry. He not only forbids them ever to be guilty of the least act, but forbids them on pain of eternal damnation. So strictly does God prohibit them from the service of their beloved idols. He threatens them with everlasting wrath for all exercises of inordinate love of worldly profit, for all manifestations of inordinate regard to worldly pleasures or worldly honors. He threatens them with everlasting torment for their self-exaltations. He requires them to deny and renounce themselves and to abase themselves at his feet, on pain of bearing his wrath to all eternity. The strictness of God's law is a principal cause of man's enmity against God. If God were one that did not so much hate sin, if he would allow them in the gratification of their lusts in some degree, and his threatenings were not so awful against all criminal indulgences, if his threatenings were not so absolute, if his displeasure could be appeased by a few tears, a little reformation, or the like, they would not be so great enemies, nor hate him so much as they do. But God shows himself to be an implacable enemy to their idols, and has threatened everlasting wrath, infinite calamity, for all that they do in the service of their lusts, and this makes them irreconcilable enemies to him. For this reason, the scribes and Pharisees were such bitter enemies to Christ. because he showed himself to be such an enemy to their pride, conceit of their own wisdom, self-righteousness, and inordinate affectation of their own honor, which was their God. Natural men are enemies to God, because he is so opposite to them, in that in which they place their all. If you go to take away that which is very dear to a man, nothing will provoke him more. God is infinitely opposite to that in which natural men place all their delight and all their happiness. He is an enemy to that which natural men value as their greatest honor and greatest dignity, and to which they wholly trust, namely, their own righteousness. Hence, natural men are greater enemies to God than they are to any other thing. Some of their fellow creatures may stand very much in their way with regard to some things on which they set their hearts, but God opposes them with respect to all their idols, and his opposition to them is infinitely great. None of our fellow creatures ever oppose us in any of our interests as much as God opposes wicked men in their idolatry. His infinite opposition is manifested by his threatening of infinite punishment, namely, his dreadful wrath to all eternity, misery without end. Hence we need not wonder that natural men are enemies to God. Section 4. The objection that men are not conscious of this enmity, answered. Natural men do not generally conceive themselves to be so bad. They have not this notion of themselves, that they are enemies to God, and therefore when they hear such doctrine as this taught them, they stand ready to make objections. Some may be ready to say, I do not know, I am not sensible that I hate God, and have a mortal enmity against him. I feel no such thing in myself, and if I have such enmity, why do I not feel it? If I am a mortal enemy, why should not I know it better than anyone else? How can others see what is in my heart better than I myself? If I hate one of my fellow creatures, I can feel it inwardly working. To such an objection I would answer. 1. If you do but observe yourself and search your own heart, unless you are strangely blinded, you may be sensible of those things wherein enmity does fundamentally consist. Particularly, you may be sensible that you have at least had a low and contemptible estimation of God, and that in your esteem you set the trifles and vanities of this world far above him, so as to regard the enjoyment of these things far before the enjoyment of God, and to value these things better than his love. And you may be sensible that you despise the authority of God, and value his commands and his honor but very little. Or if by some means you have blinded yourself so as to think you do regard them now, doubtless you can look back and see that you have not regarded them. You may be sensible that you have had a disrelish and aversion towards God, confined to that exercise for a time. The vanities of the world at the same time have been very pleasing to you, and you have been all swallowed up by them, while you have been averse to the things of religion. If you look into your heart, it is there plain to be seen that there is an enmity in your will that is contrary to God's will, if you have been opposing the will of God all your life long. These things are plain. It is nothing but some great delusion that can hide them from you. These are the foundation of all enmity. And if these things be in you, all the rest we have spoken will follow, of course. 2. One reason why you have not more sensibly felt the exercises of malice against God is that your enmity is now exercised partly in your unbelief of God's being, and this prevents its appearing in two ways. Man naturally has a principle of atheism in him, an indisposition to realize God's being, and a disposition to doubt of it. The being of God does not ordinarily seem real to natural men. All the discoveries that are of God's being in his works will not overcome the principle of atheism in the heart. And though they seem in some measure to be rationally convinced, yet it does not appear real. The conviction is faint. There is no strong conviction impressed on the mind that there is a God, and oftentimes they are ready to think that there is none. Now this will prevent the exercise of this enmity which otherwise would be felt. Particularly it may be an occasion of there not being sensible exercise of hatred. It may in some measure be thus illustrated. If you had a rooted malice against another man, a principle that had been long established there, and if you should hear that he was dead, the sensible workings of your malice would not be felt, as when you realized it that he was alive. But if you should afterward hear the news contradicted, and perceive that your enemy was still alive, you would feel the same workings of hatred that you did before. And thus, you not realizing the fact that God has a being may prevent those sensible workings of hatred that otherwise you would have. If wicked men in this world were sensible of the reality of God's being, as the wicked are in another, they would feel more of that hatred which men in another world do. The exercise of corruption in one way may, and often does, prevent it working in another way. As covetousness may prevent the exercise of pride, so atheism may prevent malice. And yet it may be no argument of there being any less enmity in the heart, for it is the same enmity, working in another way. The same enmity that in this world works by atheism will in another world, where there will be no room for atheism, work by malice and blasphemy. The same mortal enmity which, if you saw there was a God, might make you wish there were none, may now dispose and incline you to think there is none. Men are often very apt to think things are as they would have them to be. The same principle disposes you to think God has no existence, which, if you knew he had, would dispose you, if it were possible, to dispossess him of it. 3. If you think that there is a God, yet you do not realize it, that he is such a God as he really is. You do not realize it, that he is so holy as he is, that he has such a hatred of sin as indeed he has, that he is so just a God as he is, who will by no means clear the guilty. But that in the Psalms is applicable to you. These things hast thou done, and I kept silent. Thou thoughtest that I was altogether such an one as thyself. Psalm 50:21. So that your atheism appears in this, as well as in thinking there is no God. So that your objection arises from this, that you do not find such a sensible hatred against that God which you have formed to suit yourself. But this is no argument that you have not bitter enmity against the true God, for it was your enmity against the true God, and your not liking him, that has put you upon forming up another in your imagination, that you like better. It is your enmity against those attributes of God's holiness and justice, and the like, that has put you upon conceiting another, who is not so holy as he is, and does not hate sin so much, and will not be so strictly just in punishing it, and whose wrath against sin is not so terrible. But if you were sensible of the vanity of your own conceits, and that God was not such an one as you have imagined, but that he is as he is indeed, and infinitely holy, just, sin-hating, and sin-revenging God, who will not tolerate nor endure the worship of idols, you would be much more liable to feel the sensible exercises of enmity against him than you are now. And this experience confirms. For we see that when men come to be under convictions, and to be made sensible that God is not as they have heretofore imagined, but that he is such a jealous, sin-hating God, and whose wrath against sin is so dreadful, they are much more apt to have sensible exercises of enmity against him than before. 4. Your having always been taught that God is infinitely above you and out of your reach has prevented your enmity being exercised in those ways that otherwise it would have been. And hence your enmity has not been exercised in revengeful thoughts, because revenge has never found any room here. It has never found any handle to take hold of. There has been no conception of any such thing, and hence it has lain still. A serpent will not bite, or spit poison, at that which it sees at a great distance, which, if it saw near, would do it immediately. Opportunity often shows what men are, whether friends or enemies. Opportunity to do puts men in mind of doing. wakens up such principles as lay dormant before. Opportunity stirs up desires to do, where there was before a disposition that without opportunity would have lain still. If a man has had an old grudge against another, and has a fair opportunity to be revenged, this will revive his malice and waken up a desire of revenge. If a great and sovereign prince injures a poor man, and what he does is looked upon as very cruel, that will not ordinarily stir up passionate revenge, because he is so much above him and out of his reach. Many a man has appeared calm and meek when he has had no power in his hands, and has not appeared either to himself or others to have any disposition to cruel acts. Yet afterwards, when he came to have opportunity by unexpected advancement, or otherwise, has appeared like a ravenous wolf, or devouring lion. So it was with Hazael. And Hazael said, Why weepeth my Lord? And he answered, Because I know the evil that thou wilt do unto the children of Israel. Their strongholds wilt thou set on fire, and their young men wilt thou slay with the sword, and wilt dash their children, and rip up their women with child. And Hazael said, But what is thy servant, a dog, that he should do this great thing? And Elisha answered, The Lord hath showed me that thou wilt be king over Syria. 2 Kings 8:12 and 13. Hazael was then a servant. He had no power in his hands to do as he pleased. And so his cruel disposition lain hid, and he did not himself imagine that it was there. But afterwards, when he became king of Syria, and was absolute, having none to control him, then he broke out and appeared, and he did as the prophet had foretold. He committed those very acts of cruelty that he thought it was not in his heart to do, and it was want of opportunity that made the difference. It was all in his heart before. He was such a dog then as to do this thing, but only had not opportunity. And therefore, when he seems surprised that the prophet should say so of him, all the reason the prophet gives is, The Lord hath showed me that thou shalt be king over Syria. Some natural men are such dogs as to do things if they had opportunity, which they do not imagine it is in their hearts to do. You object against your having a moral hatred against God, that you never felt any desire to dethrone him. But one reason has been that it has always been conceived so impossible by you. But if the throne of God were within your reach, and you knew it, it would not be safe 1 hour. Who knows what thoughts would presently arise in your heart by such an opportunity, and what disposition would be raised up in your heart? Who would trust your heart that there would not presently be such thoughts as these, though they are enough to make one tremble to mention them? Now I have opportunity to set myself at liberty, that I need not be kept in continual slavery by the strict law of God, that I may make my liberty to walk in that way I like best, and need not be continually in such slavish fear of God's displeasure. And God has not done well by me in many instances. He has done most unjustly by me, in holding me bound to destruction for unbelief, and other things which I cannot help. He has shown mercy to others, and not to me. I have now an opportunity to deliver myself, and there can be no danger of me being hurt for it. There will be nothing for us to be terrified about, and so keep us in slavery. Who would trust your heart that such thoughts would not arise, or others much more horrid and too dreadful to be mentioned? And therefore I forbear. Those natural men are foolishly insensible of what is in their own hearts, who think there would be no danger of any such workings of heart, if they knew they had opportunity. 5. You little consider how much your having no more of the sensible exercises of hatred to God is owing to being restrained by fear. You have always been taught what a dreadful thing it is to hate God, and how terrible his displeasure is, that God sees the heart and knows all the thoughts, and that you are in his hands, and he can make you as miserable as he pleases, and as soon as he pleases. And these things have restrained you. And the fear that has risen from them has kept you from appearing what you are. It has kept down your enmity, and made that serpent afraid to show his head. as otherwise it would do. If a wrathful man were wholly under the power of an enemy, he would be afraid to exercise his hatred in outward acts, unless it were with great disguise. And if it be supposed that such an enemy in whose power he was could see his heart, and know all his thoughts, and apprehend that he would put him to a terrible death, if he saw the workings of malice there, how greatly would this restrain? He would be afraid so much as to believing himself that he hated his enemy, and there would be all manner of disguise and hypocrisy and feigning even of thoughts and affections. Thus your enmity has been kept under restraint, and thus it has been from your infancy. You have grown up in it, so that it is become a habitual restraint. You dare not so much as think you hate God. If you do exercise hatred, you have a disguise for it, whereby you endeavor even to hide it from your own conscience, and so have all along deceived yourself. Your deceit is very old and habitual. There has been only restraint, not mortification. There has been an enmity against God in its full strength. It has been only restrained, like an enemy that durst not rise up and show himself. 6. One reason why you have not felt more sensible hatred to God may be because you have not had much trial of what is in your heart. It may be God has hitherto, in a great measure, let you alone. The enmity that is in men's heart against God is like a serpent, which, if it be let alone, lies still. But if anybody disturbs it, will soon hiss and enrage, and show its serpentine, spiteful nature. Notwithstanding the good opinion you have of yourself, yet a little trial would show you to be a viper, and your heart would be set all on rage against God. One thing that restrains you now is your hope. You hope to receive many things from God. Your own interest is concerned, so that both hope and fear operate together to restrain your enmity from sensible exercise. But if once hope were gone, you would soon show what you were. You would feel your enmity against God in a rage. 7. If you pretend that you do not feel enmity against God and yet act as an enemy, you may certainly conclude that it is not because you are no enemy, but because you do not know your own heart. Actions are the best interpreters of the disposition. They show better than anything else what the heart is. It must be because you do not observe your own behavior that you question whether you are an enemy of God. What other account can you give of your own carriage, but only your being God's enemy? What other account can be given of your opposing God in your ways, walking so exceedingly contrary to him, contrary to his counsels, contrary to his commands, and contrary to his glory? What other account can be given of your casting so much contempt upon God, your setting him so low, your acting so much against his authority, and against his kingdom and interest in the world? What other account can be given of you setting your will in opposition to God's will, and that so obstinately, for so long a time, against so many warnings as you have had? What other account can be given of you joining so much with Satan in the opposition he is making to the kingdom of God in the world, and that you join with him against God, though it be so much against your own interest, and though you expose yourself by it to everlasting misery? Such like behavior in one man towards another would be sufficient evidence of enmity. If he should be seen to behave thus, and that it was his constant behavior, none would want better evidence that he was an enemy to his neighbor. If you yourself had a servant that carried it towards you as you do towards God, you would not think there was need of any greater evidence of his being your enemy. Suppose your servant should manifest much contempt of you, and disregard your commands as much as you do the commands of God, should go directly contrary, and in many ways act the very reverse of your commands, should seem to set himself in ways that were contrary to your will obstinately and incorrigibly, without any amendment from your repeated calls, warnings, and threatenings, and should act so cross to you day and night as you do to God, would he not justly be deemed your enemy? Suppose further, When you sought one thing, he would seek the contrary. When you did any work, he would, as much as is in him, lay unto destroying that work. And suppose he would continually drive at such ends as tended to overthrow the ends you aimed at. When you sought to bring to pass any design, he would endeavor to overthrow your design, and set himself as much against your interest as you do yourself against God's honor. And suppose you should moreover see him from time to time with those who were your declared mortal enemies, making them his counselors and hearkening to their counsels, as much as you do to Satan's temptations. Should you not think you had sufficient evidence that he was your enemy? Therefore consider seriously your own ways, and weigh your own behavior. How canst thou say, I am not polluted? See thy way in the valley, know what thou hast done. Jeremiah 2:23. Section 5. The objections that they show respect to God and experience some religious affections answered. Natural men may be ready to object the respect they show to God from time to time. This makes many to think that they are far from being such enemies to God. They pray to him in secret, and attend on public worship, and take a great deal of pains to do it in a manner of decency. It seems to them that they show God a great deal of respect. They use many respectful terms in their prayer. They are respectful in their manner of speaking, their voice, gestures, and the like. But to this I answer that all this is done in mere hypocrisy, and this seeming respect is feigned. There is no sincerity in it. There is external respect, but none in the heart. There is a show and nothing else. You only cover your enmity with a painted veil. You put on a disguise of a friend, but in your heart you are a mortal enemy. There is external honor, but inward contempt. There is a show of friendship and regard, but inward hatred. You do but deceive yourself with your show of respect, and endeavor to deceive God, not considering that God looks not on the outward appearance, but on the heart. Here consider particularly 1. That much of that seeming respect which natural men show to God is owing to their education. They have been taught from their infancy that they ought to show great respect to God. They have been taught to use respectful language when speaking about God, and to behave with solemnity when attending on those exercises of religion wherein they have to do with him. From their childhood they have seen that this is the manner of others when they pray to God, to use reverential expressions and a reverential behavior before him. Those who are brought in places where they have commonly from their infancy heard men take the name of God in vain, and swear and curse and blaspheme, they learn to do the same, and it becomes habitual to them. And it is the same way, and no other, that you have learned to behave respectfully towards God. It is not that you have any more respect to God than they, but they have been brought up one way, you another. In some parts of the world men are brought up in the worship of idols of silver and gold and wood and stone, made in the shape of men and beast. They say to them, let the men that sacrifice kiss the calf. Hosea 13:2. In some parts of the world they are brought up to worship serpents, and are taught from their infancy to show great respect to them. And in some places they are brought up in worshipping the devil, who appears to them in a bodily shape, and to behave with a show of great reverence and honor towards him. And what respect you show to God has no better foundation. It comes the same way, and is worth no more. 2. That show of respect which you make is forced. You come to God and make a great show of respect to him, and use very respectful terms with a reverential tone and manner of speaking, and your countenance is grave and solemn. You put on a humble aspect, and use humble, respectful postures out of fear. You are afraid that God will execute his wrath upon you, and so you feign a great deal of respect, that he may not be angry with you. In the original it is, shall thine enemies lie to thee. It is rendered therefore in the margin, shall yield feigned obedience to thee. All that you do in religion is forced and feigned. Through the greatness of God's power, you yield feigned obedience. You are in God's power, and He is able to destroy you, and so you feign a great deal of respect to Him that He might not destroy you, as one might do towards an enemy that had taken him captive, though he at the time would gladly make his escape, if he could, by taking away the life of him who had taken him captive. 3. It is not real respect that moves you to behave so towards God. You do it because you hope you shall get by it. It is respect to yourself and not respect to God that moves you. You hope to move God by it to bestow the rewards of His children. You are like the Jews who followed Christ and called Him Rabbi and would make Him a king. Not that they honored Him so much in their hearts as to think Him worthy of the honor of a king, or that they had the respect of sincere subjects, but they did it for the sake of the loaves. Jesus perceived that they would come and make Him a king. And when they found Him on the other side of the sea, they said unto Him, Rabbi, how comest thou here? Jesus answered and said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, ye seek me, not because you saw the miracles, but because ye did eat of the loaves, and were filled. John 6:15, 25, and 26. These things do not argue, but that you are implacable enemies to God. If you examine your prayers and other duties, your own consciences will tell you that the seeming respect which you have shown to God in them has only been in hypocrisy. Oftentimes you have set forth in your prayers that God was great, a glorious and infinitely holy God, as if you greatly honored Him on the account of these attributes. And at the same time you had no sense in your heart of the greatness and glory of God, or of any excellency in His holiness. Your own consciences will tell you that you have often pretended to be thankful. You have told God that you thanked Him you were alive, and thanked Him for various mercies, when you have not found the least jot of thankfulness in your heart. And so you have told God of your own unworthiness, and set forth what a vile creature you are, when you have no humble sense of your own unworthiness. If these forementioned restraints were thrown off, you would soon throw off all your show of respect, take away fear and a regard to your own interest, and there would soon be an end to all those appearances of love, honor, and reverence which now you make. All these things are not at all inconsistent with the most implacable enmity. The devil himself made a show of respect to Christ when he was afraid that He was going to torment him, and when he hoped to persuade Christ to spare him longer. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before Him, and with a loud voice says, What have I to do with thee, Jesus, thou Son of the Most High? I beseech thee, torment me not. Luke 8:28. Some may perhaps object against this doctrine of their being God's enemies, the religious affections they have sometimes experienced. They may be ready to say that when they have come before God in prayer, they have not only used respectful terms and gestures, but they have prayed with affection. Their prayers have been attended with tears, which they are ready to think showed something in the heart. But to this it is answered that these affections have risen from other causes, and not from any true respect to God.